and welcome everyone to another episode of Peak TV. My name's Ali Ukani and I drive ESG at Peak. We've got here today with us a very special guest. Welcome to Peak TV, Glenn.
Thanks, Ali. Happy to be here.
It's good to have you here. For those who are joining for the first time or those who don't know, Glenn is at the head of Environmental Clean Technologies. ASX ECT is the ticker code. We've recently backed the business and it heads into the next phase of its growth with a number of exciting opportunities ahead, tackling various areas of decarbonization and energy transition in particular. So on that note, Glenn, why don't you tell us a bit about the company?
Thanks, Harley. ECT, as we like to call it, because the name's Environmental Clean Technology, which can be a bit of a mouthful. We've been working on technology development around converting low-grade and what is often referred to as waste resources into higher value products with a low emission and preferably a net zero emission profile. We've been focusing a lot on what is often referred to as brown coal. We like to call it lignite because I think brown coal gives it a really bad name. It's only ever been called brown coal because of the way in which it's been used like black coal, whereas we see it as this really interesting chemical soup that has a lot of really valuable properties in it if you process it correctly. And so we've been focusing on that because we saw that many years ago as being a resource that was going to be problematic in the future. You know, as we know now, and we've all accepted that you can't just dig up brown coal and use it and burn it for electricity. You know, the emissions profile is not consistent with the way in which we're operating these days. So we've focused a lot on that, but we've also expanded that to include other waste products that we can blend in with that. So, you know, it really comes down to a good understanding of what our business is about is our purpose statement, and that is we bridge the gap between today's use of low-grade and waste resources and tomorrow's zero-emission future. And so really that's where we see ourselves. That's what gets us out of bed every morning, and that's really at the heart of our technology development.
Obviously, it looks like you've developed a really good suite of technologies, and there's a number of initiatives in the business that are targeting, not just brown coal, but for instance, the Bacchus Mars project, which will eventually become an integrated waste to energy facility. So can you walk us through some of the environmental clean technologies that you are looking at?
Yeah, I think it's really important to point out that we've always taken a really strong engineering and scientific approach to this. And to our credit, there's some strong science and engineering behind this. I guess what we haven't focused on so much and what we're trying to improve now is the communication aspect and the marketing side of it, because we've spent so long focusing on the science and the engineering that, you know, now it's time to actually express what this means in a modern environment. And so a lot of this is all built around, you know, taking waste products and keeping their supply demand profile as waste. You know, things like waste biomass, things like waste plastics, a lot of things like that, and particularly waste biomass. You know, we've probably seen a lot of waste to energy projects where they rely solely on things like waste biomass to come through the door. Now, the big issue with that is that waste by its very profile is inconsistent in supply and inconsistent in quality. So we took the view many years ago that something like lignite or brown coal could act as a very useful chemical baseload, which means then you keep the profile of waste as waste, you know, and it won't then, you know, you've seen a lot of projects out there being proposed whereby waste biomass will actually be of the size and scale that would become a primary feedstock. You know, so it starts displacing things like, you know, other uses of that particular forest. It's no longer just forest residue. It's now the actual forest itself is being cut down to actually supply these waste to energy projects. Whereas we're using lignite to act as a chemical baseload to then allow for many different types of wastes to come in through the door that we can process in blending with lignite. What that means is that we can scale up, we can become a lot bigger and without then changing the supply demand dynamics of waste. And so that's where we see brown coal playing its part in the future, in a sustainable future. Now, the other part to that is that our use of lignite or brown coal is then on a basis of a chemical process and an engineering process that actually does not release the CO2 in a gaseous form, or the carbon in a gaseous form being CO2. So we take a lot of effort to take an iterative process where we keep that carbon fixed so it doesn't become a problem carbon, and the only problem carbon is in this environment is CO2, and that's the biggest issue. So we like to think we take the best of both worlds, and this is what we're doing at Bacchus Marsh, is building this demonstration of how you can do this with brown coal as the chemical base load, but also with other blended wastes, turn that into a very valuable product, being both hydrogen, also soil char, but also there's opportunity to turn that into graphitic carbon for, as a key feedstock to batteries. So at Bacchus Marsh, that's what we're doing. We're taking our technology, and our technology is sort of broken down into three pieces largely. The main piece that's been applied at Bacchus Marsh is the ability to process these waste feedstocks, take out all the things that you can't use and all the things you would likely have to process that contributes to CO2. And then we put it through, so in the first instance, that's called cold dry. That's one of our primary technologies. We call that a gateway technology because that's the front end processing. That then produces a pellet that is highly efficient, that then allows for all the downstream processing into the other products. Without that, you will have just a standard process, and you won't be able to produce these valuable products without CO2. So cold dry at the front end, it then moves through a process. We've got other technologies that we're looking at that aren't specific to Bacchus Marsh at this stage, but they are complementary and they do future-proof. One of them particularly future-proofs what we're doing down at Bacchus Marsh, and that's the one we call cogen, which is the ability to extract further hydrogen more efficiently with less CO2 from this whole process. The other technology that we're really that we've been developing is a green steel technology, which again, through our discovery of the amazing chemical properties of lignite, we've worked out how to extract in situ through the process of reducing iron hydrogen, and that hydrogen is re-injected back as the fuel for that reduction process. And in doing so, you have a far lower emissions footprint than a standard steel production line.
That's excellent. So let's touch upon hydrogen for a second there, Glenn, because you've gone ahead and introduced your own category of hydrogen. For anyone who's familiar with the world of hydrogen, it pretty much looks like a shade guard. You've got gray, blue, green, turquoise. You've got Viridian hydrogen. Tell us a bit about what Viridian hydrogen really is and how that fits into your business plan.
Yeah, it was born out of necessity. The necessity came from the fact that because people saw us using non-renewable sources or non-renewable feedstocks, they immediately placed us in the blue hydrogen category. The key difference for us is we don't need carbon capture and storage to achieve a net zero emission footprint for the process itself. And that doesn't even take into account any of the carbon credits that may be accrued through the products themselves that are produced. The process alone is net zero emission. Now, that means we're very different to blue. We're also very different to another one that's sort of emerged after another colour category that's emerged after the blue hydrogen category, which is turquoise hydrogen. Now, the big difference for us is that we don't have an expensive feedstock like natural gas. Natural gas, as we know, gas prices are increasing globally, increasing in Australia. We're not exposed to that. We're exposed to waste products like lignite and waste biomass. So, at the elasticity of price movement we're not threatened as much by the likes of a turquoise hydrogen that uses natural gas. So we've got cheap feedstock, and we've got no reliance on carbon capture and storage. And so we saw ourselves closer. We'll never be green hydrogen because we're not renewable. We are part of the circular economy, but that itself is not able to be called green hydrogen. So we felt we were somewhere between turquoise and green hydrogen. And if people know their colours, right in the middle, that exact middle point is Viridian. And so we selected Viridian hydrogen as the colour category for us.
That's excellent. And surely that impacts the unit economics quite dramatically, putting you in a great spot. Just on the Bacchus Marsh project, Glenn, you've recently announced a binding JV with GrapheneX. Can you tell us a bit about the group and what GrapheneX will be doing in the project?
Yeah, that's GrapheneX. The part of the strategy that we had around Bacchus Marsh was that we needed to really bring in and show that there was not just our own enthusiasm around this process, but there were other parties that were willing to contribute funds and investment commitment into this process. And so we spent a bit of time talking to other groups, and GrapheneX has a lot of experience in this space, particularly around trying to develop technologies that then are low emission development of particularly brown coal. So they had a lot of embedded knowledge there. They've also got a very enthusiastic leader in Stephen Wee, who has, he was one of the successful candidates for the last major grant that was provided by the government that, none of the projects actually saw the money to. And I guess that's one of the problematic issues to do with large grants like that. But he won that, and that was the ALDP program that occurred, I think, back in sort of 2013 or thereabouts. So he had a lot of really good experience. He understood what we were about. He understood what we were doing, and he was willing to contribute, capital requisite with the capital that we were contributing. So, they were developing and we see a lot of these hydrogen products. We talk about hydrogen and the hydrogen that you produce from a lot of these processes, whether it's, blue hydrogen or whether it's Viridian or green hydrogen. The reality is the hydrogen markets are undeveloped at this stage. And so there's a lot of time that needs to be played into things like storage and transportation of hydrogen. So we always saw that hydrogen derivatives were going to be the first mass-produced product. Now, that hydrogen derivatives are things like, you've probably heard about ammonia, and there's other hydrogen derivatives like that, dimethyl ether, which is an LPG replacement. And in our case, GrapheneX had indicated they were working on another hydrogen derivative of their own. And so we were looking at how we could bring in early stage use of the hydrogen we would produce, because as we've indicated to the market, when we finish the build at Bacchus Marsh, we'll be the largest hydrogen producer of its kind in Australia, which means how do we get rid of it? We can't, if we're ahead of the market when it comes to storage and transportation, it could be quite difficult to, monetize that. And so we were looking at ways to, convert that quickly into something that was easily transportable and easily used. And so that was formic acid. And so it was just a good fit. They needed a hydrogen supply for their formic acid. We needed a solution for a hydrogen derivative. We added to that they were able to bring in a turbine, a multi-feedstock turbine, so we could also demonstrate that this syngas, where needed, could also produce peaking power. Again, low emission peaking power. So it was just the right fit at the right time, similar mind, similar background, and the willingness to contribute funds into the same project.
That's great. Now, let's touch upon this turbine for a second, because there's been a bit of chatter around the boards and hot coppers and the likes. Can you tell us a bit about how significant this piece of equipment is to the project and how it's going to help you fast track the development?
It's It's significant from the perspective it's an expensive turbine. It's not easy to find a turbine of that size, and so it's. But what it does do is it rounds out the full proposition for how you can use the feedstock that we're looking at. Blending waste, processing it, converting into valuable products. You want some flexibility of what you're producing. You don't want to be reliant on one product. You also want to be there to take over some of the slack that's going to be left by the closure of electricity production. There's a lot of, once you start getting into it, you start to realise that the government is really keen to see peaking plants be set up. There's going to be an issue at times when the demand outstrips the supply. As we know at the moment, electricity prices are quite, they're not that reliable. I mean, they're overall they're coming down, but you'll see that the way in which the profile of electricity production works, it's not sufficient to support things like industry, but also at the peak times. In summer when people come home from work, it spikes then, and that's when in summer the wind doesn't blow as much, and as it starts to get dark, the sun goes down. So there's a real place for peaking power. And so what we wanted to do was, we didn't want to make that an emphasis, but the beauty was that we were able to round out our proposition to make the whole waste to energy process a fully integrated process that could deliver multiple products, and products that could actually be switched in an instant into production. So it's really important from that perspective. It's a great demonstration of how that can be done, and it can be demonstrated now. As soon as we've got the engineering and the science sorted, now it's about constructing the project and demonstrating it, because that demonstration will be pretty significant and will also allow us to then justify a larger 10 to 20 times bigger build down at Latrobe Valley.
That's great. Let's also touch upon the integrated waste-to-energy facility. You've recently announced to the market an MOU for end-of-life tire processing, which to many familiar with the subject of ESG is a big environmental issue, and that's with GDT. Tell us a bit about what you're doing on that front.
Yeah, that was. We're always on the lookout for complementary technologies. We've got a vision in mind about what we're doing at Bacchus Marsh. Things that we're after and things that we're interested in is technologies that help to solve an environmental problem, first and foremost. But then secondly, those technologies that have availability of waste heat. And that was the real, because for us, waste heat is very valuable. The irony is that, we're getting very good at processing waste, and that's not just the waste feedstocks, it's also the waste heat, the heat that others can't use. And because of our unique properties of drying in cold dry, we're only, we really only need 50 degrees. Now, the more the better. That gives us a lot more room to work with. And so we identified this technology. First of all, we identified that there's a big problem with end-of-life tyres. We all know that. We've seen a lot of the stories around that in the news lines. So it was a no-brainer that this fits inside our environmental vision. And so it really came down to, well, what's in it for ECT and what's in it for integration with the cold dry process? How can we bring the costs down? And the more waste heat that we can actually bring into cold dry, that means the less heat we have to use from the syngas stream, and that's one of the products that we produce. So it falls straight to it reduces our costs of production in integrating with that. And so that was one of the interesting parts. It also, it was backed by some guys that we had a lot of respect for, and how they've approached the engineering, but also how they've approached the corporate side of things. And John Fletcher, who's former CEO of Brambles and Coles Myer, he's the chairman of GDT, and so it was a good fit. They saw the vision, and it just so happened that when we approached them, we said, well, what are you looking to do in Victoria? We've got a site at Bacchus Marsh, and it turns out that Bacchus Marsh was one of their identified key areas to develop their first license. And so I guess it was a convenient fit. It worked from their perspective, and it certainly worked from our perspective because of the waste heat availability.
Excellent. Let's touch upon the G in ESG. Much is said about the E, but a lot of companies are slowly waking up to the idea of corporate governance. Now, you've recently announced adoption of TCFD guidelines, which is fairly irregular for a small cap ASX listed company. Can you tell us why you've done that, and what are some of the benefits that ECT can derive in the future from incorporating these guidelines?
Yeah, it's for us. I mean, particularly for me, my background has been, when I became a stockbroker back in 2005, it was the area that I moved into at a time when no one cared about ESG. It was a little bit laughed at, to be honest, and so it was a natural area, and to be honest, that's what attracted me to ECT in the first place, was the environmental component. I was looking at ethical investments at the time. That was biodiesel and ethanol and things like that. As it turns out, biodiesel and ethanol are not so environmentally friendly because of the fact that it cannibalizes things like food production and other primary feedstocks. So that a good lesson to learn, but it was also really it opened my eyes to the benefits and the future benefits of the triple bottom line, or what now is called ESG. And so it was easier to adopt a lot of these things when you've already got your head around it. And the reality is, it does take a bit of time and a bit of investment, a bit of dedication. But the reality is, this is where it's going. We can't deny the momentum and the tide that's shifting on this. And so we took the view that, yes, you do have to spend some extra time, you do have to spend some extra investment, but the reality is it's there for good reason. The governance side of it is clear. It's also about transparent reporting. And it's being able to happily stand in front of your shareholders and your stakeholders and tell them exactly what you look like from a sustainability perspective, both at a governance level, a people level, and a planet level. And we're already intensely focused on environmental solutions. I mean, that's the whole basis of our business. And so it was pretty clear to us that, let's move through and take a leading front on the other two aspects. Even though only 2 years ago we're looking at going, well, should we do this? The reality is, I think very quickly now, it's not about, should you do this? It's about, when are you going to do it? And we figured, let's get our heads around it earlier. Let's adopt it earlier. Let's transform the way in which we do business to align with that now, because it's going to happen. And one of the key benefits that we found from that is that we can now talk the talk with the larger companies that are actually starting to adopt it. You're talking about big companies, ASX 100 companies, and we're having conversations with them about, scope 3 emissions and how we manage that, and we can talk scope 1, scope 2, and we can, effectively, we're talking at the same level, and that's really what I think is going to be the key driver for large companies doing deals with small companies, is the ability for the small companies to manage that risk of emissions on behalf of the bigger company they're doing the deal with. Otherwise, they're going to be cut out of the deal. In terms of it's a barrier to entry that you'll see that will increase over time, and increase very quickly over time.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, especially as we look at scope 2 and 3 emissions heading into 2030, I'm sure, as you're aware, over in the US, the SEC recently mandated that companies are now obligated to disclose how they're performing across the triple bottom line. So it's great to see ECT taking a positive step in that direction.
Yeah.
On the topic of governance, we must address the recent Labor election.
Yeah.
How do you think that's going to impact ESG businesses as a whole across Australia, but more specifically, where do you see the opportunity?
I don't see. I was having this conversation today with a number of stakeholders, and we're actually quite happy with how the election occurred. Happy from the perspective that Labor's got a majority now, which which means that they're able to make clearer decisions without sort of, influence from, the crossbench or others. So and I don't think, to be honest, Labor's quite central in their views of the world. We don't see them changing anything that would disrupt what we're planning on doing. In fact, where we see the benefit is that now we have an alignment, particularly in Victoria, between state and federal, which makes it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to change anything fundamentally. It's just that there's a greater cohesion now. There's less politics involved in terms of that, that cohesion between state and federal. So we don't see, and we've never really been concerned about too much, because the Victorian state government has a policy of the future use of brown coal. And that's one of our big interest points, is that, brown coal's been considered something to be just shut down and closed off. And we don't see it that way. We just see this as an opportunity to, reimagine the use of brown coal, transform it into a valuable resource that is of multiple value than what you would get out of just producing electricity, but with a zero emission footprint. And it's possible. And this is the thing that, we're here to try to, develop and show through demonstration, not just talk, but to demonstrate that you can actually take brown coal and you can convert it into really valuable products with no emissions. We've been using it wrong all this time. We've always known that, and that's what's sort of driven us to develop this technology, because to dig it up and burn it for electricity is just the worst thing you can do. I mean, in terms of the monetization of the value of that resource. As it turns out, it's also ethically now the worst thing you can do because of its emissions component. But that was never the argument. So for us, it's become a perfect storm, because the thing we think is most valuable is now considered of least value by a lot of people, because they don't have the technology to apply to it. And so, in pursuit of that, we also think we offer a lot of solutions to the Victorian state government that all align well with the feds as well. Insofar as, there's a lot of talk about how do you close down these mines. Well, the problem with closing these mines down is that filling them up with water isn't a solution. There's another environmental hazard about to come down the pipeline. Excuse the pun. It literally is, water stealing from valuable water being stolen from the river systems that the river systems don't have enough of. And then you've got contamination issues and all of the other problems that come with the idea that you can just fill it with water, notwithstanding it's likely to take more than 30 years plus, where they still need, once in a generation weather events to actually fill it up inside that 30 years. So there's real problems with how to shut this down. Now, we're certainly not promoting the shutdown of the mine. We're all about us acting as a transition to allow for the immediate shutdown of power generation, because we think that's a terrible way to use brown coal. It has some valuable chemical properties that are not found in black coal. So we don't even see ourselves as a coal. We see ourselves as a ancient biomass, and we've got the technology to extract the chemicals, and those chemicals are, going to provide things like clean energy and hydrogen, soil health in agricultural char, and support for the renewables in graphitic carbon to build EV batteries. So when you look at it, and if you ask the average man on the street, what do you believe that we can transform brown coal into all of those valuable products, and one of those being graphitic carbon being a critical mineral, without emissions, and derive 5 times the value out of that resource? Why wouldn't we do it?
Certainly makes sense to me, and looks like a couple of huge addressable markets in front of you. You've got obviously the agricultural market, and as we've seen in the last couple of months, food security is increasingly becoming a big issue, and also jurisdictionally. Of course, you've got hydrogen and graphitic carbon. So let's put ourselves in ECT shoes 6 months ahead. What does it look like? What are some of the next steps, and how are you going to go from back a smash demonstration to the commercial facility over in the Latrobe Valley?
Yeah, so the nub of it is that we've now raised enough money to deliver phase 2 at Bacchus Marsh. That completes the full demonstration of our process that actually shows that you can take those waste products, you can produce valuable products like hydrogen. You can also demonstrate that you can produce electricity from that with low emission, hydrogen derivatives. So we'll focus on the demonstration of that, because then that leads into the financial close requirements for Latrobe Valley. And so Latrobe Valley will be 10 to 20 times bigger. All emphasis and focus is on demonstration of Bacchus Marsh. The beauty about Bacchus Marsh is, one, it's not just a single demonstration facility. Once it's demonstrated that, then the emphasis to build focuses on Latrobe Valley, and then we transition Bacchus Marsh into a fully integrated waste innovation hub. And that allows us to further monetize and then commercialize what was initially just a demonstration project, now becomes a commercial project. And so our whole emphasis now is complete the demonstration, then provide the data, demonstration data, to drive the engineering and the financial close for the Latrobe Valley.
That's great. In closing remark, Glenn, what would you like to say to ECT shareholders, past, present, and future? Why is the company a good investment opportunity right now?
I think we provide a good leverage into what is likely to become the next commodity super cycle. Except we've got the technology to lever into new age resources, taking a waste resource and converting that into very valuable resources that will become increasingly important. We add to the whole concept the thematic of domestic security of supply. So we're not, none of this comes offshore. This is all internal. So again, we're seeing that increasing exposure to, improving domestic security for energy, for other commodities. And I think thematically, we're positioning ourselves to be the right company that supports this sustainability idea through ESG, not just through the technology that we're looking at that has an environmental impact, but the whole of company approach to sustainability. And so I think and this is what you learn, I guess, as you adopt TCFD, you learn how to recognize the opportunities and the threats in the future to ensure that you're positioning your company for a sustainable life. And so that's what I guess we represent to shareholders looking to invest in ECT.
That's well said. For all that are joining us for the first time, we've backed the company previously, and we're continuing to support. For those that have watched us before, watch this space, because it's an exciting 6 months to come. Thanks, Glenn, for joining us. Glenn Fozard, Environmental Clean Technologies, ASX, ECT.
Thanks, Ollie. Thanks for having me.